Whoa, I used to have a great big woman. Whoa, boy, she ain't nothing but skin and bone. Whoa, the first time I win $100.
Hey everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we are reading Chapter 7 of The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Remember, if you enjoy the episode, hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video. And let's dig in. The proper tactic had now been found. The Indians would not be forced to go west, but if they chose to stay, they would have to abide by state laws, which destroyed their tribal and personal rights and made them subject to endless harassment and invasion by white settlers coveting their land. If they left, however, the federal government would give them financial support and promise them lands beyond the Mississippi. Jackson's instructions to an army major sent to talk to the Choctaws and Cherokees put it this way: "Say to my red Choctaw children and my Chickasaw children to listen. My white children of Mississippi have extended their law over their country. Where they now are, say to them, their father cannot prevent them from being subject to the laws of the state of Mississippi. The general government would be obliged to sustain the states in the exercise of their right. Say to the chiefs and warriors that I am their friend, that I wish to act as their friend. But they must, by removing from the limits of the states of Mississippi and Alabama, and by being settled on the lands I offer them, put in my power to be such, there beyond the limits of any state in possession of land of their own, which they shall possess as long as grass grows or water runs. I am and will protect them and be their friend and father." That phrase, "as long as grass grows or water runs," was to be recalled with bitterness by generations of Indians. An Indian GI, a veteran of Vietnam, testifying publicly in 1970 not only about the horror of the war but about his own maltreatment as an Indian, repeated that phrase and began to weep. As Jackson took office in 1829, gold was discovered in Cherokee territory in Georgia. Thousands of whites invaded, destroyed Indian property, staked out claims. Jackson ordered federal troops to remove them, but also ordered Indians as well as whites to stop mining. Then he removed the troops. The whites returned, and Jackson said he could not interfere with Georgia's authority. The white invaders seized land and stock, forced Indians to sign leases, beat up Indians who protested, sold alcohol to weaken resistance, killed game which Indians needed for food. But to put all the blame on white mobs, Rogan says, would be to ignore the essential roles played by planter interests and government policy decisions. Food shortages, whiskey, and military attacks began a process of tribal disintegration. Violence by Indians upon other Indians increased. Treaties made under pressure and by deception broke up Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw tribal lands into individual holdings, making each person a prey to contractors, speculators, and politicians. The Chickasaws sold their land individually at good prices and went west without much suffering. The Creeks and Choctaws remained on their individual plots, but great numbers of them were defrauded by land companies. According to one Georgia bank president, a stockholder in a land company Stealing is the order of the day. Indians complained to Washington, and Lewis Cass replied, "Our citizens were disposed to buy and the Indians to sell. The subsequent disposition which shall be made of these payments seems to be utterly beyond the reach of the government. The improvident habits of the Indian cannot be controlled by regulations. If they waste it, as wasted they too often will, it is deeply to be regretted. Yet still it is only exercising a right conferred upon them by the treaty." The Creeks, defrauded of their land, short of money and food, refused to go west. Starving Creeks began raiding white farms, while Georgia militia and settlers attacked Indian settlements. Thus began the Second Creek War. One Alabama newspaper, sympathetic to the Indians, wrote, "The war with the Creeks is all humbug. It is a base and diabolical scheme devised by interested men to keep an ignorant race of people from maintaining their just rights and to deprive them of the small remaining pittance placed under their control." A Creek man, more than 100 years old, named Speckled Snake, reacted to Andrew Jackson's policy of removal. "Brothers, I have listened to many talks from our great white father. When he first came over the wide waters, he was but a little man, very little. His legs were cramped by sitting so long in his big boat, and he begged for a little land to light his fire on. But when the white man had warmed himself before the Indians' fire and filled himself with their hominy, he became very large. With a step he bestrode the mountains, and his feet covered the plains and the valleys. His hand grasped the eastern and the western sea, and his head rested on the moon. Then he became our great father. He loved his red children, and he said, 'Get a little further, lest I tread on thee.' Brothers, I have listened to a great many talks from our great father, but they always begin and ended in this: 'Get a little further, you are too near me.'" Dale Van Every, in his book The Disinherited, sums up what removal meant to the Indian. "In the long record of man's inhumanity, exile has wrung moans of anguish from many different peoples. Upon no people could it ever have fallen with a more shattering impact than upon the Eastern Indians. The Indian was peculiarly susceptible to every sensory attribute of every natural feature of his surroundings. He lived in the open. He knew every marsh, glade, hilltop, rock, spring, creek, as only the hunter can know them. He had never fully grasped the principle establishing private ownership of land as any more rational than private ownership of air, but he loved the land with a deeper emotion than could any proprietor. He felt himself as much a part of it as the rocks and trees, the animals and birds. His homeland was holy ground, sanctified for him as the resting place of the bones of his ancestors, and the natural shrine of his religion. He conceived its waterfalls and ridges, its clouds and mists, its glens and meadows, to be inhabited by the myriad of spirits with whom he held daily communion. It was from this rain-washed land of forests, streams, and lakes to which he was held by the traditions of his forebears and his own spiritual aspirations that he was to be driven to the arid, treeless plains of the far west, a desolate region then universally known as the Great American Desert. According to Van Every, just before Jackson became president in the 1820s, after the tumult of the War of 1812 and the Creek War, the Southern Indians and the whites had settled down, often very close by one another. and were living in peace in a natural environment which seemed to have enough for all of them. They began to see common problems. Friendships developed. White men were allowed to visit the Indian communities, and Indians often were guests in white homes. Frontier figures like Davy Crockett and Sam Houston came out of this setting, and both, unlike Jackson, became lifelong friends of the Indian. The forces that led to removal did not come, Van Every insists, from the poor white frontiersmen who were neighbors of the Indians. They came from industrialization and commerce, the growth of populations, of railroads and cities, the rise in value of land and the greed of businessmen. Party managers and land speculators manipulated the growing excitement. Press and pulpit whipped up the frenzy. Out of that frenzy, the Indians were to end up dead or exiled, the land speculators richer, the politicians more powerful. As for the poor white frontiersman, he played the part of a pawn, pushed into the first violent encounters, but soon dispensable. There had been 3 voluntary Cherokee migrations westward into the beautiful wooded country of Arkansas, but there the Indians found themselves almost immediately surrounded and penetrated by white settlers, hunters, trappers. These West Cherokees now had to move farther west, this time to arid land too barren for white settlers. The federal government, signing a treaty with them in 1828, announced the new territory as a permanent home. Excuse me. A permanent home, which shall, under the most solemn guarantee of the United States, be and remain theirs forever. It was still another lie, and the plight of the Western Cherokees became known to the 3/4 of the Cherokees who were still in the East, being pressured by the white man to move on. With 17,000 Cherokees surrounded by 900,000 whites in Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee, the Cherokees decided that survival required adaptation to the white man's world. They became farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, owner of property. A census of 1826 showed 22,000 cattle, 7,600 horses, 46,000 swine, 726 looms, 2,488 spinning wheels, 172 wagons, 2,943 plows, 10 sawmills, 31 grist mills, 62 blacksmith shops, 8 cotton machines, 18 schools. The Cherokees' language, heavily poetic, metaphorical, beautifully expressive, supplemented by dance, drama, and ritual, had always been a language of voice and gesture. Now their chief Sequoyah invented a written language which thousands learned. The Cherokees' newly established legislative council voted money for a printing press, which on February 21st, 1828, began publishing a newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, printed in both English and Sequoyah's Cherokee. Excuse me. Before this, the Cherokees had, like Indian tribes in general, done without formal government. As Van Every puts it, the foundation principle of Indian government had always been the rejection of government. The freedom of the individual was regarded by practically all Indians north of Mexico as a canon infinitely more precious than the individual's duty to his community or nation. This anarchistic attitude ruled all behavior, beginning with the smallest social unit, the family. The Indian parent was constitutionally reluctant to discipline his children. Their every exhibition of self-will was accepted as a favorable indication of the development of maturing character. There was an occasional assembling of a council with a very loose and changing membership whose decisions were not enforced except by the influence of public opinion. A Moravian minister who had lived among them described Indian society. Thus has been maintained for ages, without convulsions and without civil discords, this traditional government. Excuse me. This traditional government, of which the world perhaps does not offer another example, a government in which there are no positive laws but only long established habits and customs, no code of jurisprudence but the experience of former times, no magistrates but advisers to whom the people nevertheless pay a willing and implicit obedience, in which age confers rank, wisdom gives power, and moral goodness secures title to universal respect. Now, surrounded by white society, all this began to change. The Cherokees even started to emulate the slave society around them. They owned more than 1,000 slaves. They were beginning to resemble that civilization the white men spoke about, making what Van Every calls a stupendous effort to win the goodwill of Americans. They even welcomed missionaries and Christianity. None of this made them more desirable than the land they lived on. Jackson's 1829 message to Congress made his position clear. I informed the Indians inhabiting parts of Georgia and Alabama that their attempt to establish an independent government would not be countenanced by the executive of the United States, and advised them to emigrate beyond the Mississippi or submit to the laws of those states. Congress moved quickly to pass a removal bill. There were defenders of the Indians. Perhaps the most eloquent was Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey, who told the Senate debating removal, "We have crowded the tribes upon a few miserable acres on our southern frontier. It is all that is left to them of their once boundless forest. And still, like the horse leech, one insatiated our insatiated cupidity cries, 'Give, give!' Sir, do the obligations of justice change with the color of the skin?" The North was in general against the removal bill. The South was for it. It passed the House 102 to 97. It passed the Senate narrowly. It did not mention force, but provided for helping the Indians to move. What it implied was that if they did not move, they were without protection, without funds, and at the mercy of the states. Now the pressures began on the tribes one by one. The Choctaws did not want to leave, but 50 of their delegates were offered secret bribes of money and land, and the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek was signed. Choctaw land east of the Mississippi was ceded to the United States in return for financial help in leaving, compensation for property left behind, food for the first year in their new homes, and a guarantee they would never again be required to move. For 20,000 Choctaws in Mississippi, though most of them hated the treaty, the pressure now became irresistible. Whites, including liquor dealers and swindlers, came swarming onto their lands. The state passed a law making it a crime for Choctaws to try to persuade one another on the matter of removal. In late 1831, 13,000 Choctaws began the long journey west to a land and climate totally different from what they knew. Marshaled by guards hustled by agents, harried by contractors. They were being herded on the way to an unknown and unwelcome destination like a flock of sick sheep. They went on ox wagons, on horses, on foot, then to be ferried across the Mississippi River. The army was supposed to organize their trek, but it turned over its job to private contractors who charged the government as much as possible, gave the Indians as little as possible. Everything was disorganized. Food disappeared. Hunger came. Van Every again. The long, somber columns of groaning ox wagons, driven herds and straggling crowds on foot inched on westward through swamps and forests, across rivers and over hills, in their crawling struggle from the lush lowlands of the Gulf to the arid plains of the West. In a kind of death spasm, one of the last vestiges of the original Indian world was being dismembered, and its collapsing remnants jammed bodily into an alien new world. The first winter migration was one of the coldest on record, and people began to die of pneumonia. In the summer, a major cholera epidemic hit Mississippi, and Choctaws died by the hundreds. The 7,000 Choctaws left behind now refused to go, choosing subjugation over death. Many of their descendants still live in Mississippi. As for the Cherokees, they faced a set of laws passed by Georgia. Their lands were taken, their government abolished, all meetings prohibited. Cherokees advising others not to migrate were to be imprisoned. Cherokees could not testify in court against any white. Cherokees could not dig for the gold recently discovered on their land. A delegation of them protesting to the federal government received this reply from Jackson's new Secretary of War, Eaton. "If you will go to the setting sun, there you will be happy. There you can remain in peace and quietness. So long as the waters run and the oaks grow, that country shall be guaranteed to you, and no white man shall be permitted to settle near you." The Cherokee Nation addressed a memorial to the nation, a public plea for justice. They reviewed their history. After the peace of 1783, the Cherokees were an independent people, absolutely so, as much as any people on earth. They had been allies to Great Britain. The United States never subjugated the Cherokees. On the contrary, our fathers remained in possession of their country and with arms in their hands. In 1791, the Treaty of Holston was made. The Cherokees acknowledged themselves to be under the protection of the United States and of no other sovereign. A cession of land was also made to the United States. On the other hand, the United States stipulated that white men should not hunt on these lands, not even enter the country without a passport, and gave a solemn guarantee of all Cherokee lands not ceded. They discussed removal. "We are aware that some persons suppose it will be for our advantage to remove beyond the Mississippi. We think otherwise. Our people universally think otherwise. We wish to remain on this land of our fathers. We have a perfect and original right to remain without interruption or molestation. The treaties with us, the laws of the United States made in pursuance of treaties, guarantee our residence and our privileges, and secure us against intruders. Our only request is that these treaties may be fulfilled and those laws executed." Now they went beyond history. beyond law. We entreat those to whom the foregoing paragraphs are addressed to remember the great law of love. Do to others as ye would that others should do to you. We pray them to remember that, for the sake of principle, their forefathers were compelled to leave, therefore driven from the old world, and that the winds of persecution wafted them over the great waters and landed them on the shores of the new world. When the Indian was the sole lord and proprietor of these extensive domains, let them remember in what way they were received by the savage of America, when power was in his hand, and his ferocity could not be restrained by any human arm. We urge them to bear in mind that those who would not ask of them a cup of cold water and a spot of earth are the descendants of those whose origin as inhabitants of North America, history and tradition are alike insufficient to reveal. Let them bring to remembrance all these facts, and they cannot, and we are sure they will not, fail to remember and sympathize with us in these our trials and sufferings. Jackson's response to this in his second annual message to Congress in December 1830 was to point to the fact that the Choctaws and Chickasaws had already agreed to removal, and that a speedy removal of the rest would offer many advantages to everyone. For whites, it will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of country now occupied by a few savage hunters. For Indians, it will perhaps cause them gradually, under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels, to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community. He reiterated a familiar theme. Toward the aborigines of the country, no one can indulge a more friendly feeling than myself. However, the waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red men of the South and West by a fair exchange. Georgia passed a law making it a crime for a white person to stay in Indian territory without taking an oath to the state of Georgia. When the white missionaries of the Cherokee Territory declared their sympathies openly for the Cherokees to stay, Georgia militia entered the territory in the spring of 1831 and arrested 3 of the missionaries, including Samuel Worcester. They were released when they claimed protection as federal employees. Worcester was a federal postmaster. Immediately, the Jackson administration took away Worcester's job, and the militia moved in again that summer, arresting 10 missionaries as well as the white printer of the Cherokee Phoenix. They were beaten, chained, and forced to march 35 miles a day to the county jail. A jury tried them, found them guilty. 9 were released when they agreed to swear allegiance to Georgia's laws, but Samuel Worcester and Elizur Butler, who refused to grant legitimacy to the laws repressing the Cherokees, were sentenced to 4 years at hard labor. Thank you for joining me. I hope you tune in the next time. I haven't taken a look and see how much longer this chapter is, but maybe we'll see you then. Until then, hit that like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Thanks for joining me.